The static breaks first. It fills the hollowed fuselage with a dry electric hiss, louder than the wind outside. Roy Harley presses the broken transistor radio to his ear, turning it slowly, searching for a signal that might mean movement, aircraft, hope. His fingers tremble not from fear, but from cold that has seeped into the bone. The others watch him. Their breath rises in thin white threads inside the ruptured cabin. Frost clings to the aluminum walls. Outside, the Andes stretch in every direction, white, endless, indifferent. The sky is so blue it feels deliberate, as if clarity itself were mocking them. Then the voice comes through, a Chilean news bulletin. 8 days after the crash, the search has been suspended. Authorities have concluded that survival at this altitude is impossible. There are no expected survivors. The operation is terminated. Roy does not translate immediately. He lowers the radio slowly. No one asks him to repeat it. They see it in his face. Something has shifted. Something has closed. In Montevideo, families are beginning to mourn. Newspapers are preparing obituaries. The world is reorganizing itself around their absence. Up here, at 3,570 meters above sea level, they are still breathing, but officially, they are already dead. The mountain does not care. It did not care when the aircraft struck its ridge at 300 kilometers per hour. It did not care when the wings tore away and the fuselage became a falling cylinder of metal and bodies. It does not care now, as the living sit beside the frozen dead, calculating how long breath can be sustained without food. There will be no rescue, only cold, only hunger, only the choice to continue. They came from Montevideo, from Uruguay, a small nation pressed against the Atlantic, where rugby was more than sport. It was identity, brotherhood, a particular kind of faith. The Old Christians Club drew its players from the Stella Maris College, young men from middle-class families, medical students and law students and sons of businessmen, friends since childhood. They traveled together, trained together, laughed at the same jokes, and argued over the same trivial matters that young men argue about when life still feels infinite. They had chartered a Uruguayan Air Force Fairchild FH 227D to fly from Montevideo to Santiago, Chile, where they were scheduled to play a match. 45 souls boarded that aircraft on the 12th of October 1972. Among them were players, family members, supporters, and crew. The mood was light. Some slept. Others played cards. A few stared out the windows at the jagged spine of the Andes rising beneath them, unaware that they were looking at the geography of their own reckoning. The crash came without warning. The pilots had misjudged their position. In poor visibility, descending too early through a pass they believed they had already cleared, the aircraft clipped a ridge at nearly 300 kilometers per hour. The right wing sheared away, then the left. The tail section tore free, carrying passengers into the void. What remained of the fuselage, a severed tube of aluminum and terror, plunged down a steep glacier, sliding and spinning until it finally came to rest in a snowfield at approximately 3,570 meters above sea level. The silence that followed was absolute. No sirens, no rescuers, no sounds of civilization. Only the wind moving across the snow, pressing against the wreckage like a hand testing for warmth. Inside the fuselage, the living began to separate themselves from the dead. 12 people had died on impact or in the immediate aftermath. Others were gravely injured. Bones protruded from skin. Skulls had been fractured. Blood froze before it could fully pool. Those still capable of movement worked through the twilight hours, dragging the wounded into the shelter of the broken cabin, piling luggage and seat cushions against the gaping hole where the tail had been, doing what they could with nothing. That first night, they huddled together for warmth. The temperature dropped to 30 degrees below zero. They had no blankets, no sleeping bags, no insulation beyond their own bodies and the thin fabric of their clothing. Some prayed, some wept, some simply stared into the darkness, listening to the groans of the injured, waiting for a dawn they were not certain would bring rescue or merely more cold. It did not bring rescue, nor did the second day. nor the third. They organized themselves as best they could. Marcelo Perez took charge, his authority as team captain extending naturally into this new and brutal arena. Medical students Roberto Canessa and Gustavo Zerbino tended to the wounded, setting fractures with makeshift splints, cleaning wounds with melted snow. They had no antibiotics, no painkillers beyond aspirin salvaged from luggage. Surgery was performed without anesthesia, using broken glass and determination. Water was obtained by melting snow in aluminum sheets shaped into troughs, angled toward the sun. The process was slow. The yield was meager. The snow burned their lips and left a metallic aftertaste that never quite faded. Food was a more immediate crisis. The aircraft's cargo held little of nutritional value. A few chocolate bars, some wine, crackers, jam, distributed carefully among the survivors. These provisions lasted only days. And then there was nothing. At altitude, the body consumes itself more rapidly than at sea level. The thin air demands more effort for every movement. Breathing becomes labor. Thinking becomes difficult. The heart races even at rest, struggling to oxygenate blood that refuses to carry enough. Hypoxia creeps in like a fog, slowing cognition, dulling perception, making decisions feel distant and unreal. The cold compounds every deficit. Hypothermia steals heat from the extremities first, then from the core. The body begins cannibalizing its own muscle tissue for energy, metabolizing itself in a desperate bid for survival. They grew weak, faces hollowed, eyes sank into skulls. The injured grew worse. Some died quietly in the night, their breath simply ceasing, their bodies cooling into the same temperature as the snow beneath them. Starvation is not a sudden event. It is a slow erosion. First the fat goes, then the muscle. The mind remains conscious longer than it should, aware of its own diminishment, watching the self disappear by degrees. After 2 weeks without food, the survivors faced a choice that no philosophy or theology had prepared them for. The dead lay preserved in the snow outside the fuselage. Their bodies had not decayed. The cold had kept them intact. There was discussion, argument, prayer, silence. Some could not accept what was being proposed. Others understood that refusal was its own form of death. Eventually, a decision was reached. Not with triumph, not with ease, with resignation, and with a solemnity that bordered on the sacred. They would consume the flesh of the dead. They would do what was necessary to live. It was not done carelessly. It was done with ritual, with respect. Small portions were cut from the bodies, dried in the sun, consumed without ceremony, but without savagery. Some survivors made private pacts to offer their own bodies if they should die. It was understood as an act of love, not desecration, a gift from the dead to the living. October became November. The survivors adapted to their reduced existence. They developed routines. They assigned tasks. They told stories to pass the hours. They planned an expedition to escape the mountains. Though they lacked equipment, maps, and strength, they were not passive. They were not resigned. But they were trapped, pinned beneath a sky that offered no mercy and above a world that had forgotten them. On October 29, the mountain moved. An avalanche swept down the slope in the middle of the night, burying the fuselage and everyone inside. Snow poured through the gaps in the wreckage, filling the space in seconds. Survivors clawed upward through the darkness, suffocating, disoriented, fighting for air. 8 more died that night, including Marcelo Perez, the captain who had held them together, and Liliana Methol, the only woman among them. The avalanche sealed them inside the fuselage for 3 days. They could not move. They could not dig out. They survived on melted snow dripped from the ceiling of their tomb, breathing air that grew stale, waiting for the weight above them to shift. When they finally emerged, the landscape had changed. The snow had risen. The dead were buried beneath fresh layers. The survivors stood blinking in the sunlight, diminished in number, devastated in spirit, but alive. By early December, it was clear that no rescue would come. The only path to survival led over the mountains themselves. Nando Parrado had been unconscious for 3 days after the crash. His mother had died on impact. His sister Susanna had survived initially, only to succumb to her injuries days later. He had watched her die, had held her hand as she slipped away. Now he was the most determined among them. He would walk out of the mountains or die trying. There was no alternative he was willing to accept. Roberto Canessa, the medical student, agreed to accompany him. They prepared as best they could. Clothing was layered from the dead. Sleeping bags were sewn from insulation salvaged from the tail section, which had been located in an earlier expedition. Meat was packed for the journey. They had no compass, no crampons, no experience in mountaineering. They had only each other and the will to move forward. On December 12, Parado, Canessa, and a third survivor, Antonio Vizintin, began the climb. They ascended slopes of ice and rock, moving slowly, stopping frequently, gasping in the thin air. The peaks above them seemed impossibly high. After 3 days, Vizintin was sent back to conserve supplies. Parado and Canessa continued alone. They climbed for 10 days. They crossed glaciers. They descended valleys. They slept in the open, pressed against rock faces, wrapped in their improvised sleeping bags, listening to the wind howl around them. They ran out of food. They melted snow in their mouths. Their bodies burned through the last reserves of fat and muscle. Their feet blistered and bled inside their inadequate shoes. But they did not stop. On the 20th of December, 1972, Parado and Canessa reached the edge of the mountain range. They saw something they had not seen in over 70 days. Green, vegetation, trees, a river, signs of life. They descended toward it, their legs barely holding them upright, their minds struggling to process the change in terrain. And then they saw him. Sergio Catalan was a Chilean arriero, a horseman tending cattle in the foothills of the Andes. He spotted 2 figures on the opposite bank of the Rio Azufre, gaunt, bearded, skeletal. He thought at first they were tourists. Then he saw their condition. He could not hear them over the roar of the river, so he threw a pencil and paper wrapped around a stone across the water. Parado wrote a note. He explained who they were. He told of the crash. He begged for help. Catalan read the note and understood. He rode for 10 hours through the night to alert authorities. The next morning, helicopters were dispatched. On December 22 and 23, the remaining 14 survivors were evacuated from the crash site, carried down from the mountain where they had lived and died, and been reborn into something they did not yet understand. The world celebrated their rescue. The press called it a miracle. Survivors returned to families who had mourned them, to lives that had moved forward without them, to a society that did not quite know how to receive them. Questions came about the bodies, about the flesh, about what they had done to stay alive. They answered honestly. They did not apologize. They did not sensationalize. They explained what they had faced and what they had chosen. Some condemned them. Most understood. The Catholic Church in Uruguay declared that no sin had been committed. Survival, in extremis, carries its own moral weight. But the survivors did not speak of miracles. Not really, not in the way the newspapers did. They spoke of ice, of silence, of watching friends die slowly, of choices that could not be unmade, of the mountain that did not hate them, did not hunt them, did not care whether they lived or perished. It simply existed, vast and cold and permanent. They were the ones who had to decide what existence meant in its shadow. 72 days passed between the crash and the rescue. Of the 45 people aboard Flight 571, 16 survived. The youngest was 19, the oldest was 26. They returned to a world that had declared them dead. They carried with them memories that would never fully fade, scars that would never fully heal, and a knowledge of themselves that most people are spared. The Andes remain. The glaciers shift slowly, burying and revealing, indifferent to the meaning humans impose upon them. Somewhere beneath the snow, the wreckage of the Fairchild still rests, along with the remains of those who did not return. The mountain holds them, the way it holds everything, without judgment, without memory, without release. And the survivors carry the mountain with them still, in the hollows of their cheeks, in the silences between their words, in the way they look at food, at cold, at the faces of their children. They learn something in that place, something that cannot quite be translated into the language of the lowlands. That civilization is a thin membrane stretched over a vast indifference. That the body knows what the mind refuses to accept. That survival is not redemption. It is merely continuation, with all its costs and all its gifts, until the breath stops and the cold finally wins.